Hello, my friends. I'm Rick, and this is your seat at the table, as if you didn't already know. And we are looking at what I believe is 3.5's editions of Arms and Equipment Guide for Dungeons and Dragons. Uh, I have a second edition version for sure because I've done a video on it. It's posted on the channel. And I believe I have another equipment guide that belongs to the 3 era. Don't quote me on that for sure. Uh, this one here has a lot of good material in it, and it covers a number of extra areas that I find uh, creatively imperative. Anyway, there's another thing that makes this particular book kind of unique. I got this secondhand from the bargain book at the bargain bookstore at JC Hobby some years ago, and one of the first things I noticed on the inside was the previous or the original owner, the first owner of the book, did time. This person was in prison or is still in prison. I don't know. I didn't bother to look up the code number and because I'm just kind of I guess it's none of my damn business, but I just found that interesting, and it just goes to prove to you that uh, games in general have very long legs, and they're deeply entrenched in our society here. And so it's not surprising to find these things in prison. They're going to be in limited numbers. They're going to be susceptible to a lot of criteria based on the individual facilities and the states. Some states are more lenient. Some facilities are more lenient. Some are not. Some believe that this messes with your psyche and your head. And others will dictate that it trains you to act out as a you know to pretend to be something that you're not, which is not what they want, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of stigma that goes along with it, but there's still a lot of draw. I just find that to be very uh, interesting. So when we look at the contents, your typical weapons and armor, adventurers gear, and we're always looking for new stuff, new inclusions, because if you go back and look at the original equipment lists, for example, that come into player handbooks and predates those for the older game systems, they're very limited. There's not a lot there compared to how much stuff that really does exist in the world and what's available. So we get things like food and drink, unique alcoholic beverages, alcohol intoxication. This is something that I always enjoyed having a set of rules, hard set of rules for, because you always seem to get at least one table, at least one individual at a table who's a big fan of pretending that their characters are alcoholics and are consumed by it. So, I mean, having some base rules to how to moderate it and how to handle it when they're under the conditions and so on and so forth is not a bad thing. It also helps cut down on arguments. Chapter 3 vehicles. This is something that a lot of tables I've noticed over the decades tend to downplay or ignore outright. So we talk about things like maneuverability, propulsion, controlling the vehicle combat, collisions, attacking a vehicle. So let's talk about that for a second. I've repeatedly mentioned that I did a campaign for a better part of a year called Two Men and a Dwarf, or Two Dwarves and a Wagon. I actually, one of the few campaigns I had took the time to print out and bind up as a type of booklet because it was so complete. And the idea was two players, because that's all I had at the table, were going to be teamsters. They got hired to drive a wagon around all these little outposts, connecting the Dwarven mountain home to all their far flung mines and watch posts and trading places and things like this, little villages. And one of the more than one incident involved vehicle combat. And I think in the one episode where one of their main competitor, if you will, their main competition, got into it with them running with what amounted to a running gunfight because they were both racing their wagons down this road, trying to beat the others to something, and next thing I know, they're shooting crossbows at each other and blunderbuss bullets at each other, and it just turned into a thing. So having some rules on it was helpful. I've had other systems rules that allow you to do that too. You can find them in the GM guide in some places, and in some of the other wider ranging supplements for D&D. We also get into this chapter 4, hirelings and creatures. This is something that has some. I have mixed opinions on it. I believe uh, that we don't address this like we used to. We don't use the hirelings and henchmen tables like we used to. And I go back looking when I was younger and realized that we were using them inappropriately back then. We weren't using them right, and it was something that I didn't understand until I got older and I started looking at this from a bigger picture. So why do we need henchlings and hirelings? That argument. Well, who's watching your horses while you're down in the damn dungeon for 3 days? Well, ideally, back in the day, this was envisioned as like a major. It wasn't a handful of guys, a handful of people on mules, horses, wandering up into the hills to go on an adventure. This was literally a expedition. So uh, you would have retainers and guards and pack handlers and then the associated, maybe you'll have a cook, maybe you'll have some wranglers, you'll have, you could have 10, 20, 30 people in this group. I often point out the comparison to the opening scenes of Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark of the Covenant, when he's pushing his way through proverbial, a South American jungle, whether it was the Amazon or whatever, I don't remember. Anyway, he was pushing his way through it, and what did he have? He had porters, he had associates, he had a flunky. There was another associate waiting nearby on a river with a boat, or a boat plane, just in case. I mean, this was something well thought out in advance, and that was kind of the point. And then we see it again in the was it second installment? What is that? I know what it is. I can see it. The Kali Temple of Doom, whatever the hell it was. One of the lesser popular of the movies. So I found it pretty entertaining. I never found an issue with it. But the idea there too. So when he's going to go on and press on, they can give him some porters. They got an elephant, etc., etc. Well, that's the whole kind of idea. So when Agar Gygax in those early days, they may have been looking at stories and books and movies on expeditions that have been made by real people, like Admiral Byrd to the Antarctic, for example, and look at how many bodies were involved in those things. It wasn't just one dude in the middle of nowhere trying to survive. So I mean, we underutilize this section in a lot of aspects, in my opinion. Somehow, like a lot of things, we don't bother with them anymore, like encumbrance and are they keeping enough food and water handy and things like this? Because who wants to be bothered by them petty little things when we can have all the excitement of the combat? And then we get this chapter on magic items, special magic items. That cat's out there doing something. One of our cats keeps wanting to climb, wants to eat the tree. He didn't used to bother. This first year he's bothered the tree. The last couple of years he never bothered it. But we used to let him outside. Now we don't do that. We stopped letting him out, Doofus and Sissy outside back in the spring, and because of the fleas got really bad, and Doofus getting bad about going way up by the Second Avenue by the trucks or there's a car lot up here that sells Jeeps and trucks, and we find him up there too often, and I just got worried about him, so we just don't let him out. We don't let him out anymore. And so this is the first year he's trying to eat the tree. Well, we bring him. I'm trying to get some cat grass for him, but you got to find. I want to find it that's already grown. I don't want a kid I got to grow myself, which is all I can seem to find. And of course, dried stuff, lemongrass, things like that. But there's only so much you can give him. He's just being ornery, in my opinion. So, introduction: incorporating items into your campaign. What's in this book? Larger and smaller weapons, new weapons, weapon descriptions, and we go through quite a bit of similar stuff, and then we get a few extra new ones in here that I don't remember seeing. They may have popped up other books. It's hard to keep track. There's so blasted many things these days. It's easy to lose track of the little details. The weapons and technology, weapon equivalents, weapon materials, new armor types, armor technology, new armor materials. See, it's like when they introduced the idea of masterwork, I often argued that in order for a magic item like a weapon to become imbued with magic, it starts out as a masterwork, so it has to be a masterwork. And of course, my philosophy was that by definition of being a masterwork, it's better made, it's sharper, it holds its edge longer. By definition, it should be a plus one weapon. Now, to make that clear, not a plus one magical weapon, but just a plus one. So I got into the habit of just arbitrarily issuing every masterwork item that come out with an extra bonus. So a masterwork armor, masterwork weapon is going to be superior than a non-masterwork, which goes without saying. So it should have an outright distinct difference. So a plus one attack modifier. So if you get a plus one magic sword, now the sword is technically magic. That's the only thing that sets it apart from being the masterwork. So that plus one doesn't get tapped. It just means that it has the magical properties, or it has magical bypasses, which allows it to quote be the magical weapon. So the plus one originally came from being a masterwork item. So if at that point we go to looking at a plus two item, or plus three, or plus four, so on and so forth, these are magnitudes of increases. So at this point, the masterwork can either be one of two things. We could either have the uber masterwork, and there would be the heroic work, or the epic level work of a weapon, which then would grant it the plus two without it having a magical property. If it has plus two magical properties, then obviously it's a magical weapon at this point. But you could, in theory, still have a plus two extremely well-made sword. But once you start progressing into the plus three and above, this obviously, for game mechanics, has to include either extremely rare metals and elements that would make them set them apart as as an epic level masterwork, versus a magical epic level masterwork. And the well, anyway, that's just me going off on a rant on my thing on how I look at that sort of masterwork and how it's applied. Chapter 2, Adventuring Gear, New Equipment, the armor maintenance kit, the animal call, a cinder slider, a banner standard, barbed wire, bolt cutters. You know how many times I had players go, "Why can't we just get some bolt cutters?" And I had to explain to them, well, since they weren't in the early stuff, it was considered a mechanical device, which then would not be likely to be available unless you either found some dwarves that specifically had something like this, which they likely would, and gnomes more likely than not might have them. Especially if we're talking tinker types anyway. Lots of new stuff, lots of interesting things in there. It's a nice, if you I don't care what version of D&D you play, or any kind of fantasy role-playing game. Truth is, a lot of non-fantasy role-playing games, these equipment guides are valuable. They have uses across the genres. And I've known people who collected these things. They collected player handbooks and the equivalent thereof, but they also collected arms and equipment guides for that very reason. It's a very useful piece of equipment as far as I'm concerned for anybody's table. And of course, we got into a little bit more expansion on food and drink. So we got spices and seasonings, corns, flours, dried fruits and vegetables. See, they're trying to expand a little bit more on what's available for creative purposes. It's easy to sit there and go, give me this and give me that, but if you have much more options. And then there's the other thing. Well, people say, well, most people don't go through the hassle and the logistics of figuring out, okay, well, we've got, there's 4 of us and we got 40 retainers and associates that we got to take take care of, and the animals, and et cetera, and et cetera. So we got to figure we're going to be out there for 6 weeks. We're going to need 6 weeks of food supply for everybody and for the animals and that. And this is where this comes in when you start buying things in bulk items. If you bother to worry yourself about that sort of stuff, not everybody does, and I have mixed opinions on it. I'm all for doing it if your table's willing to do it. If they're not big on being accountants, then don't push the issue. New game masters, this is important stuff to learn. You have to gauge your players at the table. Some of them are going to be more inducive to certain things than others, and some of the less important seeming mechanics that they tend to not want to do. Read your table is what I'm saying. Trying to get across. Make sure you read your table. Don't try to force this stuff on them. But we're in the case of my example of two dwarves and the wagon, though, this made much more value because at this point we can say, okay, your wagon will hold 1,000 pounds, 1,000 pounds, and we're going to put 500 pounds of barley on there. Well, what does 500 pounds of barley look like? Well, depends, right? If you're talking 100-pound bags, that's 5 bags, 5 bags. If we're talking 10 bags, if they're 50, if they're 50 pounds a piece, or what, 50 kilos a piece, whatever, and then you can start getting an idea of just what kind of bulk and what we're talking about, what kind of containers, and it has a role in secondary stuff, but it gives more feel and depth to the campaign setting, in my opinion. And of course, here's our effing PC soft help driver updated that I tell constantly, stop, because I don't want the damn scan. I don't want you scanning my crap, and I don't want you to frickin' sell me nothing, so fuck off. I get so fed up with it, and it will pop up at least once more. It just will not stop. It gets old real quick. What do you do? All right. So specific clothing, jewelry, accessories, etc. Special and superior items. Not many particular things. Trade goods, economic systems, chapters on the vehicles. So we talk about, vehicles are used in D&D games as one of 3 ways, each of which is described below. The quick off-camera transportation goes with what pretty much straightforward. Props in unusual set-piece battles. All right, yeah, so in our 2 dwarfs and a wagon, there were at least 2 different combats that took place, and I use the term loosely because one of them was the first combat was more of a wrestle-tussle fest, fisticuffs, because they weren't outright trying to kill each other, but they were in competition. So the PCs were fighting their primary NPC competitors outside, in a snowstorm, at a way stop at night, in a yard full of snow-covered wagons and stuff. So yeah, the wagons served many roles in that particular incident. So the other combat was numerous times when the players were using the wagon they weren't, if they didn't have to stop and fight it out, they weren't going to. They wanted to keep going, and the idea, hence the reason they had pencil-mounted weapons and they had other stuff. The idea being is, like they had rigged up 2 bags of caltrops, I think, at the back of the wagon, so they could pull a rope and drop the caltrops, caltrops behind them. Which then, of course, at some point we had to put that to a test, because I'm a big believer if your players go to the length to do things like this, they're going to modify their vehicle to do tricks, or they're going to this or that, then by God, you should tap that at some point. Make them vindicated. Make them feel like they did all that for nothing, that it actually served them or it didn't. Because sometimes they don't work like they plan them, and that can be fun by itself. Just my opinion. So then the organizing principle of the campaign. Maybe the characters you venture are all officers of a privateer hunting the seas, queens, flows, etc. Quick tour of your vehicle, keeping a point that I was referring to wagons because, on a different campaign that I did, and I mentioned on a regular basis, when I was doing play-by posts on D&D Beyond, was this basically a group on a river barge going through the following this very long river, trying to get rid of a MacGuffin. And they had several combat scenarios where one scenario where a number of skiffs were chasing them from a previous village because the locals had discovered that there were a couple people on board the boat that were wanted, had wanted posters out and were worth some coin for various reasons. So they were pursuing them with the intentions of collecting their bounties. And then there was the combat with the bungee jumping goblins that was swinging out of the trees, and so having sets of mechanics available for this sort of thing is a nice thing to have. If I go back to the earliest days, they were very thin. The earliest basic expert set almost had nothing. They had a little mentions of it, but nothing. First edition started to expand a little bit on it. It wasn't until second edition that they start seeing expanded books, source books, and stuff that start covering things like vehicles and vehicle combat in D&D specifically, and naval combat, which is something that's been underplayed in D&D since its existence. Which I wish they had better rules for. Nautical combat for boarding actions, things like this. But they've come a long way from what they were 40, 50 years ago. So maneuverability, propulsion, or-powered vehicles, drawn vehicles, right? Controlling the vehicles, out-of-control vehicles, vehicle combat, collisions, attacking vehicles, repairing and building vehicles. Most common vehicle combat I've ever experienced in the Dungeons & Dragons setting specifically is naval combat, which ironically, like I said, in the early days, we had very little to work with rules wise, and we had to kind of limp our way through what we had. It was more or less a floating platform for melee combat. There wasn't a whole lot of ship to ship combat directly, and in part wasn't because of the lack of weapons and stuff. It was just a lack of players and resolve. One of the things about naval combat, if you're going to be on a ship, for example, the crew generally, or the players generally, are like the special ops team for the crew, or are paid passengers of the crew, meaning that there has to be a crew. So you have a ship with a dozen people, or 20 people, or 2 dozen, or 3 dozen, or whatever, depending on the size of the ship, and you need to take that into account appropriately too. So I mean, kind of a little bit more going on there than what you might think from the beginning. And you're shortchanging your players and your tables if you don't take advantages of all the nuances that the vehicle combat, vehicle operations bring to the table. I mean, we talk about players being in scenarios where I need to spot something or listen or check, and you're rumbling down a lane in a damn wagon. That's going to diminish your ability to do that. Just like having to keep in mind that weather suddenly becomes more important when you're trying to get your wagon load of goods from point A to point B. So, I mean, I'm just saying. Vehicle statistics block. Right? Smaller vessels, medium vessels, so we're talking water vessels specifically, air vessels, land vessels. Air vessels. I had one campaign that I was sitting in a dentist office years and years ago, and he had this diorama painting that was on the wall of what I assumed was, because by the look of it, it looked like Atlantis. So with this fictional view of what Atlantis looked like, and there was this dirigible, this airship, this water-based ship being held up by a big balloon, like we see in a lot of memes in fantasy today, and it's cruising up over this ridge and down into the valley. You can see the rings and the marine not the aqueducts, but Jesus, the canals and stuff that supposedly made up Atlantis. And I got looking at that, and that gave me inspiration for having a campaign that was similar to this, where the characters we're seeing a lot more aerial combat. And then years later, there was a movie, and I want to say Bruce Willis was in it. Don't quote me on that, which that kind of even further emphasized that possibilities. And then even later, there was a modern day take on the Three Musketeers. And the very end of the movie, which I always felt was sad that they never followed up with it, because it just reeked of an obvious second movie in the series was the bad guy. Lord, what's his face, escaped back to England. And then he shows him coming back he's at the helm of an air fleet of these balloon ships heading for France. And I thought, yeah, that's the sort of stuff. And one of y'all was making comments on one of my previous videos, and mentioned something. They mentioned something about Three Musketeers, and I thought I have had several attempts over the decades at trying to run something similar. And as I pointed out to others who wanted to run it, I said, Three Musketeers are right up D&D's alley. The mechanics are all there and supportive for it. Even the muskets, even you're starting to get to the more of this steampunk era at that point, and I think it's great. Just my opinion on it, whatever. Ships like this, aerial boats like that kind of stuff. Siege vehicles, special vehicles. Then chapter 4, hirelings and creatures. Finding hirelings, guilds, cost of hirelings. So hirelings and these come in several categories. Certain hirelings do not go on adventures. That's not what they're due. That's not what they're for. What they're due is to build and maintain your hideouts, or your fastness, or your fort, or your temple, or whatever it is your characters are wanting to build. You might hire somebody to keep a couple people to keep it clean, some people to keep it secure while you're not around, people to keep maintenance, that kind of stuff. Those people generally don't go with you, and then you get the ones that do. So you can get porters, you can get pack handlers, you can get guards and specialists, and some are more willing than others to go out into the field, and those require resources and money. So we talk about costs and hirelings and things like this. Another aspect of this that I think gets underutilized or undertapped from experience is that if your characters are operating, for example, out of a city environment, the whole campaign is a city campaign. At this point, your players, if they want to bribe and tip and outright hire people for jobs and for one-offs, encourage them to do that. So this is like developing contacts. If your group's rogue has working knowledge of the city's underworld, maybe he's even a member of the local thieves guild, or at least is in good standing with them, because they made one of the early episodes or early scenes of the campaign is where the rogue goes to the head yahoo of the local thieves guild to kiss the ring, so they don't get themselves and their group in trouble. So maybe you're going to hire a couple of the street urchins to be your eyes and ears in the city, and that's going to become henchmen. You get where I'm going with that? There's so many opportunities there. It's just like tipping. So we all go to we all have a favorite tavern we go hang out at, and the tavern's got a damn bartender, and they got a regular servers, and they have a bouncer. Well, maybe you should get on good terms with the bouncer, make sure you tip the crap out of the servers, and be on good terms with the owner or the innkeeper, the tavern. Just saying. And all them categories fall under this umbrella of stuff. If you're not utilizing it, you're missing out on a lot of opportunities here. So non-human hirelings, mercenaries, and paying mercenaries. Now, I've actually had a group of players who were pretty slick. They had an encounter earlier on with an orc tribe, and the orcs were up to no good, of course. And there was a brief conflict, mostly that the orcs had staged an ambush to, and jumped the players, and the players more or less handed them their heads, which is what to be expected. But they did is they'd also let half of the orcs get away on purpose. So they later on in the campaign, they decide that one of their goals was to try to gain access to this baron's fortified castle city, town, whatever. And so when the Barons' arrogant people basically barred them, wouldn't let them come in because they looked too shabby, too shady by themselves. They concocted this scheme to go back to the orc tribe and hire them to raid the Barons' town, to attack it. They didn't have to succeed. Preferably, they didn't want them to succeed. Uh, They also were pretty dipulous, so thankfully there were no lawful good types that had to make a moral judgment here, because at the height of the attack, the orcs are attacking the city or the village, and with mixed results. The player characters come out of the woods to rescue ride to the rescue of the village. Killed more than a few of the orcs, sent the orcs running. And of course, that was a very argument that you cheated and you lied and you misrepresented yourself to the orcs. But who are they going to complain to? Who are they going to complain to? I mean, and it worked, because then the local villagers saw them as heroes, and the Baron was grudgingly forced to accept that these people had did something right, even though they were never aware that it had been manipulated from the very beginning. I'm just saying that the opportunities are quite wild and vast with these. And we move on to the section on companion, pets, and mounts. Now, two things come up right off the bat. A lot of players see episodes of the Beast Man or something like that and think, I want my own ferret, I want my own this, I want my own that. And then, of course, you have the magic user types and their familiars. Then you also have the warriors, the fighters, specifically the fancier ones like the cavaliers and the paladins, and so along those natures, the knights. Their animals, their pets, their horses are more than their extensions of themselves, and they're more than just pets. And a lot of times, if I want my horse to be able to come when called, and do parlor tricks when I need them to, come save me and untie ropes and do other things. Well, this makes this animal into the heroic version of the average animal. We now have something that's evolved and has become better. This is the same argument that I use when players frequently utilize their riding mounts, for example, as part of their campaign operations. And then I say, okay, fine. So for your animals, so every time you go up in level and experience, for every 3 levels you go up, your animal goes up by 1. Or if you're literally using that animal every round or every encounter, almost every day that you're campaigning, then perhaps that ratio of experience goes up by equal numbers. So as you level up, so does your animal companion, so does your familiar, so does your horse. So these animals are then able to pick up feats and learn tricks and do things that you want them to do, and makes them more formidable and more defense capable and smarter. The list just goes on and on. And this is how you get that. If you want that, this is the mechanics you start from, in my mind. It really helps you a lot down that road. And guard animals, guard creatures, and some of them pretty exotic. And some of the tricks, you want to tame an owlbear, you're not going to tame an owlbear. It's just not going to happen. You don't want to tell a rust monster not to attack a rust, not going to happen. So, mounts. Then we get new equipment, magical items, bracelet of friends, bridle of ease, clever bridle, etc., etc. Now, the dire bat, dire badger, riding dog, elephant, rhinoceros, llama, warg. Yeah, I knew one. There was one guy that who played the dwarf, and he absolutely insisted that his dwarf was riding a boar. And so then we got into this discussion during session 0. Okay, let's nail down this boar a little bit. And he's looking at me sideways, and I said, now I want to understand. So we're talking, a big honking farm pig, or are we talking like a wild boar? They're big differences. What do you mean? I said, look, I grew up around farms. I'm telling you right now, the wild boars are they're far more vicious, they're hardier, and they're tougher than a bred and raised pig. So a farm boar from a farmer's field not so much of a don't get in there and piss them off, but they're not anywhere in the same category as a wild boar. Big difference. And there's a reason why they differentiate boar from pig, because even though they are very closely related, they are distinctly different and their characteristics are different. And so the guy's like, well, I never thought of that. So I mean, so what you're going to do is what I said, you want this animal that's very resilient and very ornery as your ride. Well, then you'd have to have certain kinds of handling skills and a repertoire with them. But that also means that the boar gets an attack. The boar gets to rake with its tusks. It can bite you and do damage. Boars are tenacious too. So, and they're fairly hard to kill. It takes a lot to kill one of these things if you're trying, you either got to get a lucky shot with a boar spear or a rifle, and nobody's running around with rifles in D&D, at least not most campaigns anyway. Not to say that it's impossible, because it is possible. We get to books like Planar Travel, we're going to talk about some of that stuff perhaps. Anyway, all right, so gelatinous cube. Nobody rides a gelatinous cube. The gelatinous cubes are not mounts for the faint of heart or those in particular hurry. Bizarre cavalry in the Underdark Wars, gelatinous cubes were used to herd opposing troops and chew through defenses and protect valuable spellcasters from after their magic spent. So when I look at this sort of stuff, I mean, a lot of people look at it and go, man, move on. And I look at this and go, how can I create a scenario where my characters, the player characters, find themselves standing off against something that's riding a gelatinous cube? How, in my mind is I have to figure out how that functions, how it's not, eating the whoever's riding it, and how it's getting controlled, because these things are not exactly prone to be controlled. But the sheer absurdity, or what the WTF moment of those players going, what is worth, it's worth the experience. It's worth the effort of attempting. And if it fails, it fails. So be it. But at least you made an effort. You made an attempt. So we get into the next chapter, 5 magic items. Lots of new stuff, lots of old stuff. Mostly old stuff doctored up as new stuff. A couple new things. Nothing fantastic. I've always been more interested in the weapons creation, or the creation sections on magic items, because at a certain point, there are thousands of magic MacGuffins you can tap. But some of the best ones over time are ones that you create yourself, or created themselves. I mean, and I don't know what name I used for the damn campaign, but the riverboat campaign, there was this figurine, and I got the idea of the figurine from the Drizzt Do'Urden saga, where Gwynthir, his magical astral projected companion, has this figurine, and the idea is you rub the figure, he's attached to it, so you rub it, it summons his spirit, etc., etc. And so I thought, well, let's have something like this, but I want to use it as a trap. So it has a succubus trapped inside, and the succubus wants to manipulate everything and get its way, and to get it back out of its trap. And so I went from there, and it was a kind of a combination of this and the other thing to give me what I was looking for, and kind of how you want to look at it. So being able to use the rules to adjust the mechanics for something, or to create the thing using the mechanic rules, it's always a good one. Crossbow of trailing flame. Right. I've said that before. One of my early on original concepts for magic items I created, is I came up with this line of arrows that had runes embedded on them. So when the arrows impacted on whatever you hit them with, it would fire off that rune, and the rune would enact this magic component, whatever it was. And so we had some that had spider something on it. So basically, it would hit you and splatter you with the version of a spider web and hook you to a wall. There was another one that was that had a low level fireball attached to it. I think it was a first level, or the lowest level fireball we could justify putting on the arrow. And then there was the exploding arrow, which actually was a exploding rune. And And then just on them lines, I think I had about a dozen different types of specialty arrows using runes. The only one I had one that was a mechanical grappler thing at the end of an arrow. It had a pretty hard negative modifier to hit your prod, but you're shooting at something you're trying to hook on, not necessarily something that's trying to eat you while you're doing it. So, right. It's just the possibilities. It's always interesting to try to lots of good stuff in the books, but it gives you ideas and material for more ideas for clever things on your own creation, for your own table, and for your players. It's just like the reverses player is true. Players will often come up and they're just itching to do something specific. A One that seemed a common theme was some sort of flashlight or idea, some kind of item that would allow them to see in the dark. And I've come up with a number of variations on that over the decades, or they have. And then I've looked at it and I go, well, this is real good. I have no reason why we can't use this. Or I'll look at this and I go, okay, this is a little overpowered because perhaps we need to adjust this and to eliminate this because now you're trying to get greedy. Or the opposite way. I've had this come up where they've come up with something that was very modest and very well thought out. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, yeah, but you could also utilize this for this, this, and this. So why don't we stipulate that now? We'll give it modifiers. So if you're using it in this condition or this condition, etc. And they were on board with it. We talk about potions, rings, rods, staves, wondrous items, various types. Great. Go on. And let's see, magic items. Cursed magic item, common curse description. We got some artifacts, blade of fiery might, crystal of the Ebon flame. So that little figurine icon, a MacGuffin I created, technically would have fallen under the idea of an artifact, although I argued that it really wasn't because it had been the demon had gotten tricked and manipulated and trapped by a spellcaster for devious purposes. And there's certain criteria that keeps it trapped to the figurine because ideally the demon is sufficiently powerful enough it should have been able to break free of the thing itself. But there's some divine stuff involved, right? Which was one of the reasons why the group's quote retired paladin turned chef, the ship's cook, was having such a trouble with it because this thing kept trying to tempt it by giving, whispering in his, mentally whispering in his ear and trying to entice him and trying to lead him to do things and to question his moral standing. And he's like, well, you're no longer this, and obviously they've turned your back on you, et cetera, or you're tarnished or somehow. And actually it worked for a while. And then the player got annoyed with it and asked that I stop doing it. And I didn't catch the player's complaint fast enough, and so when I didn't do it right off the bat, the player got butthurt and quit. That was the downside of a play-by-post setting or anything online. The people just get a bug in their ass, they can walk away from it. And then the guy came back later and apologized and wanted to re-enter the group. And I looked at it and I said, no offense, but at this point, no, I'm not. I don't think so. And I didn't. His reasoning and his was understandable, but at the same time, I don't think. I don't know. His expectations were a little different, and I was very clear at the very beginning, and I made that point to him that this was going to be a bit darker and going to be of adult nature, meaning that adult themes are involved. And if you can't cope with that, then you should have said that from the damn session 0 and bailed. Now, there's the problem with that session 0 thing. There's a lot of people who want to play and are willing to tell you, will agree to anything that will get that achieved. And then later, as the game progresses, suddenly their issues start to resolve or start to emerge, and they have problems with it, and either they're overtly problematic with it, or they're subtle about it, and they're trying to screw with you how you do things because they want things to be their way they want them, and they're failing to understand, or they're intentionally failing to understand what the whole point of the exercise was, in my opinion. What do I know? So then we got the Rod of Seven Parts, Treasure and stuff, Index, things like this. I love these books. I always have. You can never have enough of them, and don't kid yourself. Well, I'm getting the next version, so I'm going to get rid of all my old stuff. Well, that's a fool thing to do. These things have value long past the era that the edition that they were created for. And they also, like I said, they cross genres. That I've tapped D&D equipment guides before for Star Wars because there's such a range of stuff. Not to mention, I made the point that if you look at a genre such as Star Wars, there are worlds that are highly sophisticated, highly technologically advanced, and then for every one of those, there's probably 100 worlds that are not. And for every one of those, there's at least one that's extremely primitive. And those extremely primitive worlds is where stuff like this just rocks because and you can justify some of it by saying technology. So they have a weapon that's better than what you think it would be. Was because it's made out of exotic alloys, or there's a manufacturing process that puts such a keen edge on it, but it's still a bloody sword. So is it magical? No, unless you can figure out a way to tie in, and there is between the Force and other, you know, magic like affections out there for Star Wars, you could tap into them and stuff. Anyway, this is the Arms and Equipment Guide for 3.0, I believe, and this was published 2003. I'm Rick. You're not